Hey there. I wanted to spend a little bit of time today giving you some historical background on what we're going to talk about in our next class, which is the very complex dispute over the status of the territory called Israel and Palestine. I'm going to do this in two sections. So the first section is going to be talking about the historical background behind the foundation of the present-day state of Israel in 1948, and then I'll preview a couple of the reasons why in the present day this dispute is so complex. So let's start with that historical background. First, just to get you geographically and sort of linguistically oriented, the territory that we're talking about today, I'm going to refer to more or less interchangeably as the state of Israel or Palestine. Different terms are used in different ways depending which historical period you're talking about and also depending on your political perspective. And by using those terms interchangeably, I'm not intending to take a side on any of the present day issues. I just want to acknowledge that you'll hear those terms used to describe the same chunk of land, depending on context. So here it is on the Eastern Mediterranean. This territory of Israel-Palestine is historically the home to the Jewish people, and it was also the location of the biblical kingdom of Israel something like 3,000 years ago. Since the establishment of the kingdom of Israel, this territory has fallen under a bunch of different types of political sovereignty, and in particular, the Jewish people in ancient times were displaced by various empires, including the Babylonians, the Persians, the general Alexander the Great and his successors. The Romans show up and their Byzantine successors maintain sovereignty in Palestine. The Arab Empire will first reach Palestine in the 7th century, shortly after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. The Crusaders will briefly establish a state in Jerusalem. The Ottoman Empire will conquer it, and actually the Ottoman Empire will control that territory up until the end of the First World War, and that's where I'll start our timeline. It's just worth noting that a couple of things that we tend to say about the Israel-Palestine conflict and why it's so difficult to resolve are really not that historically accurate. So for one thing, it's really common to hear that this is a conflict which has gone back centuries or millennia, which is as old as time itself, and that's kind of an ahistorical framing. There's some really specific and relatively recent developments in the 20th and 21st centuries that have a lot more to do with explaining the present-day tensions in the area than anything that happened, 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. The second assumption that we tend to make is that since time immemorial, the Arabs and the Jews, or the Muslims and the Jews, have been these two concrete, distinct groups which are always butting heads with each other. But that's a little bit of an oversimplification too. There were people of Arab descent, of Arab identity, in Palestine long before even the foundation of Islam, even before the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Working primarily as traders, as itinerant artisans, and there's lots and lots of cultural mixing and blending between Arabs and Jews and the many, many, many other groups that live and trade and work and travel in the territory that we now call Israel-Palestine. A third thing worth noting, and we emphasized this early in the course when we talked about the history and the theology of Islam, but it bears repeating here, is that the tradition of Islam is not necessarily hostile to the Jewish people and the other way around as well. And it's just worth pointing out that the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam, situates himself in the direct line of Abraham, of Moses, of Jesus, that he regards the Jews as people of the book, that there's a good deal of overlap between the theology and the traditions of those two religious faiths. And so I don't want you going into this thinking that Arabs and Jews or Muslims and Jews are just two profoundly different groups of people who will never have anything in common and who have always hated each other. Please don't buy that when you hear it as an explanation for the conflict, because I think it locks us into a line of reasoning that really makes this seem much more hopeless and insoluble than it actually is. So I'm going to start my timeline. I'm going to bounce forward to the 20th century in order to start giving you a more detailed timeline of how the state of Israel in the modern day sense comes to be founded. And we have to start the story with the end of the First World War. The treaties that end the war are signed in 1919, and one of the major effects of that is the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. This matters for Palestine because the Ottoman Empire had previously held sovereignty in Palestine and present-day Israel. So the British find themselves occupying this territory after World War I ends, and they're in quite a bit of I guess the term is trilemma, because they've made three contradictory promises during the course of the war about what's going to happen to Palestine. The first is that in a series of back and forths called the McMahon-Hussein letters, the British diplomats have promised to Arab leaders that if the Arabs will support them by rising up against the Ottoman Empire during World War I, then after the war is over, the British will support the establishment of an independent Arab state whose boundaries will include Palestine. So on the one hand, the British have promised a state in Palestine governed by Arabs in exchange for Arab assistance in World War I. The second declaration is that, again, hoping to curry political support for the war effort and for the government, the British government has also issued this document called the Balfour Declaration, which says that His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. So they've simultaneously promised that this territory is going to be an Arab state and a Jewish state. But they've also signed a secret document with the French, which says that after the war is over, the British and the French will divide the Middle East into different spheres of influence across, they literally draw a dotted line on the map. The British will be able to dominate politics in the territory north of the line, the French will dominate territory in the south of the line, and Palestine falls on the British side of the line. So the British, by 1919, are in a difficult situation because they've simultaneously promised the same territory to the Arabs, to the Jews, and to themselves. In 1922, the legal status of Palestine is resolved for the moment by the League of Nations, which you'll remember is this international body designed in the wake of World War I to peacefully resolve disputes. Spoiler alert, doesn't work, but you knew that already. The League of Nations takes on the task of parceling out all the territory of the defeated empires in World War I. And among other things, they decide that the British will have control of Palestine in a legal structure known as the Mandate. So not only do the British have the right to administer Palestine, that right comes with certain responsibilities which are laid out by the League of Nations. So there's some terms and conditions attached. An important feature of the League of Nations mandate, of the terms under which the League of Nations hands over Palestine to British control, is that it says that Britain is supposed to prepare Palestine for the establishment of a Jewish national home. So it doesn't immediately create a Jewish state, but it does instruct the British to start laying the groundwork for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. At the same time, that mandate also says that the British are expected to respect the rights and the privileges of all residents, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of religion. And so that's going to leave the British, again, in a situation where they have to manage these competing demands of the predominantly Arab population that's already there and the Jewish population that's going to increasingly migrate during the term of the mandate. So what you can see in this chart is that that blue bar, which represents the share of the Jewish population in the total population of Israel-Palestine, is going to get steadily larger. So the population of the territory as a whole is going to increase pretty significantly. You'll see lots of migration into Palestine in this period, but the bulk of that migration is going to be accounted for by Jewish people who are, among other things, fleeing persecution in much of Europe, particularly in the years running right up to World War II, not just in Nazi Germany, but elsewhere in Europe as well, and also pursuing this dream of a Jewish national homeland. So the advent of British mandatory or colonial control, depending how you want to describe it, and the influx of Jewish settlers coming to Palestine is going to spur, as you might have predicted, resistance, sometimes violent, on behalf of the Arab population of Palestine that was already there. In response to this, the situation becomes tense. Both sides start to arm themselves, and you start to see clashes break out occasionally between both sides. For their part, many of the Jewish settlers will form self-defense organizations on the premise that they need to be able to provide physical security for themselves if the British administration might not be able or willing to do that. For their part, the Arabs are also going to organize both formal and informal organizations, and their activity is going to reach a peak in an event known as the Arab Revolt, which starts in 1936 and lasts through 1939. The Arab Revolt, it's worth noting, is targeted most directly against the British, and the Arabs in Palestine are rejecting not just this influx of Jewish migration, but also more generally the concept of British colonial control in Palestine overall. This is a pretty significant and long-lasting insurrection. It's going to result in nearly 20,000 Arab casualties. The United Kingdom, as you can sort of figure out, is already facing a really difficult set of dilemmas. And after World War II, in the context of the more general movement away from empire that happens in British politics, after World War II ends, the British are going to be increasingly eager to get rid of the Palestinian question, the Palestinian problem. And so in 1947, the British government kicks the question to the newly formed United Nations and asks them what the British should do with Palestine. The United Nations comes back in 1947 with a plan of partition, which you can see mapped out on this image here. The territories in blue are expected to become a Jewish state. The territories in orange are expected to become an Arab state. And then the city of Jerusalem, which is that white dot in the middle, is supposed to be under international administration because it has really significant religious and cultural significance for both Arabs and Jews. So Israel and Palestine, under this plan, are going to be divided into two separate states. The United Kingdom, once this plan goes into effect, will withdraw its troops. So we will also have, as we do in India around the same time, the creation of two independent sovereign states. And Jerusalem, as I said, will be placed under international control. The problem with this plan is that the United Nations votes to pass it in 1947. The Arab states, most of the Arab states vote against the plan in the United Nations, and then after it's passed, immediately reject it altogether. They have problems with the content of the plan. In particular, the UN plan gives about 56% of the territory to what was then about the 30% of the population that was Jewish. And so there's some discontent with the substance, with the way that the borders are drawn. But those Arab states that reject the plan are also going to make a bigger procedural claim, which is that it's fundamentally illegitimate for the international community to decide on the status of a territory that, from the perspective of the Arab states, is already is fully capable of settling its own disputes. And so civil war breaks out within Palestine pretty much immediately after the partition plan is passed. And you can kind of see, given the level of increasing tension and violence and military organization that's happening in the 1930s and the early 1940s, you can kind of see why that's likely to happen. In May of 1948, leaders of the Jewish community in Palestine are going to essentially say, well, we're going to behave as if this partition plan has been implemented, and we're going to declare independence as the new state of Israel. This is the founding of the state of Israel. And if you ever, by the way, get asked of an example of the creation of a new state in the post-World War II period, Israel is a perfectly fine one to use. British troops get out of the way. They evacuate the day of or the day after the Israeli Declaration of Independence. And I should mention, too, that the United States immediately recognizes Israel as a sovereign independent state, sends a letter of congratulations. The Soviet Union actually recognizes Israel pretty quickly thereafter. This is the point at which the civil war in Palestine transitions into an international war. A coalition of Arab states is going to launch an invasion of Israel in an attempt to undo what they viewed as this illegitimate United Nations partition plan. The results of that war might be surprising if you consider the numbers of the populations of the respective countries. The Arab states pretty definitively lose. Israel gains a bunch of territory, so I'll flip that map for you again. This first one is the partition plan that the United Nations had voted to approve in 1947. The second map shows you the territories that are controlled by Israel, that's that solid beige color, versus the territories controlled by Arab states. And so the two major geographic chunks of territory that remain in Palestinian or Arab hands are what's called the West Bank, which is under the control of the country of Jordan, and then the Gaza Strip, which is controlled by Israel. So the Palestinians lose more territory than they had been expecting to lose under this plan. A huge number of Palestinian Arabs are going to flee, and many of them will end up becoming refugees in Jordan and in other neighboring Arab states. And you should flag that in your brain because it's going to remain an issue even up to the present day. Israel, as a consequence of the war and of the demographic change, the migration that happened immediately after, becomes a majority Jewish state and has remained a majority Jewish state demographically up until the present. So I just want to flag for you that at this point in this video, I'm gonna stop doing a blow-by-blow narration. I'm gonna gloss over a bunch of complex issues, which I encourage you to read more about if this is something that interests you, because there's really great historical scholarship about the events that will happen in the subsequent 70 plus years after the independence of Israel. But I don't want to get bogged down in the details, because my focus for the rest of this video is going to be just outlining some of the reasons why reaching a political settlement between Israel and Palestine is going to be fairly difficult. So there's a series of wars between Israel and Arab states after the Declaration of Independence of Israel. That first one I just talked about starts in 1948 when Israel declares independence and Arab states invade in an attempt to reclaim territory for themselves or for the Palestinians. The second one happens in 1967. It's known as the Six-Day War. Again, in that one, a coalition of Arab states invade Israel, and Israel gains back yet more territory, which you can see on this map in the middle. In particular, Israel occupies the entire Sinai Peninsula, which had previously been Egyptian, and is going to hold on to that until 1979. The third of those wars is again going to be started by a coalition of Arab states in 1973 on the high holy days of Yom Kippur, and yet again Israel is actually going to defeat that invasion and gain some more territory. After the 1970s, it's worth noting that the conflict in Israel-Palestine shifts from Israeli-Arab conflict to largely an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's this treaty signed between Israel and Egypt has been kind of the leader of a lot of these coalitions of Arab states attacking Israel. There's a accord signed in 1979 between Israel and Egypt, brokered by the United States, in which Israel gives the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt, and in exchange for that, Egypt recognizes Israeli statehood. And this is really considered a major breakthrough. And Israel is going to continue to negotiate kind of, if not peace treaties, at least understandings with a number of those other Arab states in the ensuing years. And so that's going to become, the consequence of this is that it's largely Palestinians themselves and no longer other Arab states that are engaging in the primary advocacy, both violent and nonviolent, for Palestinian statehood and independence. The basic question today, the basic question about how to resolve the status of Israel and Palestine today centers around this idea of a two-state solution. And this has been what the United Nations and a lot of other major powers have been calling for since 1974, is that there should be, as was originally envisioned in 1947, two separate Israeli and Palestinian states. As you can imagine, there has been, and probably with every presidential election and every presidential or Secretary of State trip to the Middle East, you've probably heard in the news that there's been many, many, many attempts to restart or to facilitate or to change the parameters of peace talks and of statehood talks between the Israelis and Palestinians. And there's a bunch of reasons why those negotiations are just fundamentally very difficult. The most basic of those is borders. If you're going to have two states, you have to draw lines on the map that say where one begins and the next one ends, and that's a very disputed question. And the basic question there is that right now Israel controls a much larger territory than it was supposed to according to that 1947 partition plan. And so there's one side which says, well, we should draw the borders where they are, and there's another side which says we should go back to the borders the way they were before 1967 and the Six-Day War, in which Israel gained control of a lot more territory. So there's many, many, many variations on that question of just literally where to draw the line. Second is the question of settlements. Over the last several decades, more and more Israeli civilians, for both economic and ideological reasons, have been building settlements in territory that is supposed to be Palestinian, according to the post-1967 borders. And so there's a question of whether those settlers, who in some cases have now lived in what's Palestinian territory for generations, the question is whether those settlers are going to be uprooted and asked to move back to Israel, or whether there will be some acknowledgement of their legal status in what could be a future Palestinian state. The third has to do with the city of Jerusalem, which has tremendous religious significance in Judaism, in Christianity, and in Islam. There are some people on both sides, on the extremes of both sides, who say that Jerusalem should not be divided and should be under the total control of either the Israelis or the Palestinians. There's other people who advocate a divided or a neutral Jerusalem, but there's a lot of questions surrounding how it's going to be governed and what its political status is going to be. And you might know that the question of even whether the United States will recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel is very, very politically inflammatory in the United States, much less in Israel and Palestine. A fourth question is what to do with refugees. There's about 5 million people of Palestinian origin who have fled to elsewhere, to other Arab countries primarily, and there's a question of whether those people should have the right to return to Israel after having been forced out or after having left in the wake of Israeli independence in the first Arab-Israeli War. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly from the Israeli perspective, although I don't want to overgeneralize there's serious questions about security. Since the 1990s in particular, there have been a variety of militant groups in and outside of Palestine that have launched various attacks on Israeli territory, on Israeli settlers, on Israeli civilians, and on military targets. Some of those are being launched from the Gaza Strip, which is this little chunk of territory bordering Egypt and the Mediterranean. That's one of the two sort of sovereign Palestinian or quasi-sovereign Palestinian territories. There's also groups, for instance, Hezbollah in Lebanon, which launch attacks from foreign countries against Israel. And so for many Israelis, a paramount question is what's going to happen in a two-state solution to guarantee that we will have physical security, that these attacks on Israeli territory won't be tolerated or sponsored by a sovereign Palestinian state. One last thing that I should say, and I will back up to a map here so that I can clarify this. If you look at this map on the right-hand side, that's current as of about 2011. Borders have not changed significantly since then in terms of who lives where. The status of Palestine today is a little bit legally complicated. There's two major chunks of territory which are considered Palestinian territories. One of those is the Gaza Strip, which is down in this border on this border with Egypt and the Mediterranean Sea, one of the most densely populated areas in the world. The other is the West Bank, so-called because it's on the west bank of the Jordan River. It borders Jordan to the east. That's a larger territory. Both of these territories have some degree of self-governance. They have some ability to make domestic policy decisions, but they're pretty significantly limited, and they're not internationally recognized by a huge number of states as being sovereign states. So the present-day political status of Palestine is that it's a territory with pretty limited autonomy. It's not completely under Israeli governance, but it's also not a fully sovereign state. And so the question of a two-state solution is really about how to resolve that status in a more permanent and legally definitive way. I'll stop there. We'll talk about this pretty extensively in class, and of course, I'm very happy to take whatever questions you have. Thanks very much, and I'll see you soon.